It is the spring of 1940, and the world is falling apart. Across the Channel, the iron breath of war rolls in, swallowing nation after nation. France is teetering, Belgium has broken, Norway has been lost, and soon Britain will stand utterly alone. In this moment, when hope feels like smoke slipping through fingers, a voice rises from a small office at 10 Downing Street. You are there, just outside the door. The building is quiet, except for the low murmur of voices and the rhythmic ticking of an old brass clock. Inside, a man paces with the weight of a century on his shoulders. He's short, broad, nearly 70. His eyes are sharp as winter light, his voice like gravel and thunder. He lights another cigar. He speaks to the cabinet, to the air, to history. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. Those words don't just echo in Parliament. They ripple across radios, drawing tired eyes upward in bunkers, kitchens and shop floors. People clutch their coats a little tighter, not from fear, but from a spark rekindled. A voice has arrived that sounds finally like victory may still be possible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? It always warms me to see how these quiet journeys bring people together across different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe fluff your pillow and get comfortable in your bed. Adjust the volume and brightness of your device. Soften your breath. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment stretches on. Outside, the lamplights flicker. Somewhere down the street, a bus rumbles past, almost unaware that the fate of a nation is being balanced by the steady hand of a man who has failed more times than he's succeeded. That's where our story begins, at its highest flame. And from here, we slip backwards, into memory. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was not born to a gentle life, but neither was he born to rule. He was a child of aristocrats, a soldier of the empire, a writer of restless energy, a politician of impossible opinions. And somehow, all of those threads led to this precise moment where he became the lighthouse in the fog. Historians often say 1940 was Churchill's finest hour, but what they debate, endlessly, curiously, is whether the man rose to match the moment, or if the moment was waiting for the man. A quieter, lesser-known story from these same months tells of how Churchill, despite the bombings and war councils, insisted on having his bricklayer continue work on the garden wall at Chartwell, his beloved home in Kent, not for show. Just because beauty must go on. Even now, when he is preparing speeches that will be remembered for centuries, he takes time to write a short note to his wife, Clementine, ending it with a doodle of a pig in a top hat. If you were there, walking quietly through the garden paths of Chartwell, you'd see a red wheelbarrow, half full with stone. You'd hear the scrape of a trowel. You'd sense that, even in war, something very human and very hopeful was being held together. As night falls on London, Churchill remains at his desk. A single lamp glows beside him. The phone buzzes. Reports roll in. Outside, the air raid sirens moan like distant wolves. But he stays rooted. This is not the start of a career. This is the peak of a storm. And it's here, in this moment, that his full story begins to unfold, chapter by chapter, memory by memory, until we reach the very first breath in the echoing halls of Blenheim Palace. So now, with the world balanced on the edge of fire, let us take a step back to the beginning. It was a cold November day in 1874 when the first cry echoed through the stately corridors of Blenheim Palace. The child born that day, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, came into the world not in a modest cottage or quiet townhome, but within the sprawling grandeur of one of England's greatest estates. The air inside was perfumed with coal smoke and old velvet. Chandeliers caught the pale light like distant stars. History already seemed to linger in the corners of that house, as if waiting. Winston was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill and Jenny Jerome, a New York-born beauty with a spirit as fiery as her dark eyes. His father was sharp, ambitious, distant. His mother, enchanting but largely absent. Between these two glittering figures, the little boy often found himself unseen. Raised more by nannies than by parents, Winston's early years were filled with longing, for attention, for approval, for something warm and steady in a life of glittering coldness. If you stood at the top of the wide staircase in Blenheim, looking down, you might have seen him, small, red-cheeked, with a stubborn set to his jaw even then, dragging a toy soldier across the marble floor, narrating battles only he could see. He was a child of contrasts, fiercely imaginative, endlessly talkative, and maddeningly rebellious. Tutors despaired. Impossible to educate, one noted. He wouldn't sit still, couldn't spell, and refused to memorize facts he found dull. He failed the entrance exam to Harrow twice. His father, embarrassed and impatient, nearly gave up on him. And yet, once he was in school, something curious began to happen. Not in math or Latin, no, but in language, in words. Winston discovered he had a gift for rhythm, for speech, for turning thought into thunder. His essays rang with conviction. His letters home were filled with charm and flair, but most of all, he longed to be seen by his parents. Letters to his mother, dozens of them, read like little cries across the ocean of her social life. "I would like to see you, Mummy. When are you coming to visit?" Her replies came, but seldom with haste. Historians still argue whether this emotional distance sharpened his will or wounded it. Did it forge the steel of his ambition, or simply leave a lifelong ache? One strange detail from these years stands out. He had a pet frog. Not in the school dormitory, of course, but tucked into a garden back at Blenheim. He claimed it followed him, understood him, sat beside him when he talked about battles and victories not yet lived. Teachers dismissed it. But decades later, in a quiet interview, Churchill would still smile at the memory. He was a loyal creature, he once said, unlike some humans. By the age of 14, Winston had taken on a certain rough pride. He knew he would never be the favourite, never the son who won awards or passed quietly. So instead, he would become loud, bold, fearless. He would make them notice him. And one day, when the world needed a voice, he would have it ready. At school, he began to develop his lifelong habit, speaking as if he were already part of history. He didn't answer questions. He delivered declarations. Teachers punished him with writing lines. He didn't mind. That only meant more practice. If you had been seated near the back of a classroom at Harrow, say around 1888, you'd see him now, scratching away with a fountain pen, head tilted just slightly, muttering the words under his breath like a chant. Not the assigned lines. Number something else entirely, a speech maybe, or a letter to himself from the future. By the time he left school, his grades were average at best, and his reputation was firmly intact as the one who always talks too much. But deep inside, something had taken root. He didn't yet know what he wanted to do, but he knew he wanted to matter. There's a beautiful irony in it all. The man who would one day inspire millions with his words was, for many years, told his words were foolish, his questions too loud, his imagination too big. And yet, he clung to it all, as if he already sensed that a child's stubborn belief in their own worth might one day move the world. As the chapter of childhood began to close, a new stage beckoned, military college, a path that would lead him not just to maps and medals, but to deserts and jungles, prison camps and escape routes, war cries and whispers of destiny. It was the year 1895. The air in London still smelled of coal and carriage wheels. The world was turning rapidly. Telegrams clicked through cables, railroads stitched across continents, and Queen Victoria's empire stretched like a golden net across the map. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a young Winston Churchill, fresh out of the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, was preparing not just for a life of service, but a life of story. Winston had finally found a place where his restless energy made sense: the military. It offered structure, movement, a sense of purpose. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a stage. He had graduated with honours in cavalry, not infantry, which spared him the heavier mathematics. But he wasn't in love with soldiering. Not really. He wanted to see things, to write, to be close enough to danger to taste it, but not to be swallowed by it. If you were standing beside him that autumn in a dusty corner of Havana, you'd see a strange sight. A young English officer in a spotless white uniform, sketchbook under his arm, scribbling observations while bullets whistled overhead. Cuba was in revolt, and Churchill had come not just to watch but to report for a British newspaper. That's how his double life began, not just as a soldier, but a war correspondent. He would go on to write from India, the northwest frontier, the Sudan. He charged with the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman, sword drawn, heart thudding. It was real combat, and yet he was already thinking in sentences. "I was not the only man who survived," he later wrote, "but I was the only one who could write it." He wasn't wrong. His books, the story of the Malakand Field Force, the River War, were filled with vivid detail, sweeping action, and a sharp eye for absurdity. Critics found them too bold, too sure, too Churchill. Historians still argue whether these early campaigns shaped his political courage or merely whetted his appetite for fame. Did danger humble him or thrill him? Was he more observer than warrior? Somewhere between columns and cannon fire, a strange event unfolded. During the Second Boer War in South Africa, Churchill, still technically a civilian correspondent, was captured in a railway ambush, thrown into a prison camp in Pretoria. Barbed wire, hard floors, endless heat. The guards underestimated him. Everyone did. Then, one moonless night in December 1899, he scaled a latrine wall and disappeared into the dark. His escape became legend. He rode hidden in train cars, slept in ditches, and bribed his way across enemy lines. When he returned to British territory weeks later, newspapers hailed him as a hero. His face appeared on front pages. The public, hungry for courage, found their new darling. If you had been there that night, crouched beside him in a shallow ditch just beyond the prison walls, you would have seen the outline of a man absolutely still, not from fear, but calculation. His breath low, his eyes focused. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howled, and Churchill whispered to himself, "I will not be caught." Years later, he would smile when asked about that night. "Nothing in life is so exhilarating," he said, "as to be shot at without result. It's easy to see only the bravery here, the wildness. But there was something more forming in him during these years, a belief in destiny. That his life was not just his own, but a thread in a much larger pattern. He didn't talk about it often, but those who knew him in his 20s said he walked with the air of someone already halfway inside the future. In 1900, not yet 26 years old, Churchill returned to England with war medals, best-selling books, and a name people recognised. He ran for Parliament, and won. There's a quiet moment many forget. The train ride from his constituency back to London that winter. Snow lined the fields. The coach was mostly empty. He sat alone, coat pulled tight, rereading his speech notes by the dim lamplight. If you had been seated across from him, you'd have seen it. Not nerves, but electricity. A young man who believed, completely and without apology, that he was born to lead. But before all that, before the campaigns, the crowds, the grand halls, there was a single moment of stillness, the train rocking softly, a pocket notebook open on his lap. And in that moment, the future leaned in, waiting. The year was 1900, and Westminster was a maze of whispers and old stone. Gas lamps flickered against the carved ceilings. Coats rustled like dry leaves as members entered the House of Commons, carrying with them the weight of empires and amendments. Into this world of seasoned statesmen, clipped accents, and silent glances walked Winston Churchill, only 25, barely settled into his boots, but already certain of his path. He did not walk quietly. His first speech in Parliament came with nervous energy and confident tones. He stood too straight, spoke too fast, and filled his speech with flourishes. Some rolled their eyes, others leaned in. Even his critics admitted he was unforgettable. Churchill entered politics under the Conservative banner, like his father. But in a move that startled many, he crossed the floor just 4 years later and joined the Liberal Party. "A rat!" some shouted. "A renegade!" others whispered behind their papers. But to Churchill, it was simple. He followed his convictions, not party lines. At least, that's how he saw it. Historians still argue whether this move was driven by principle or by strategy. Was it a genuine shift in values, or a clever calculation to stay in step with the times? If you had stood in the gallery that day, watching him cross the aisle with barely a glance back, you might have sensed it wasn't about loyalty or betrayal. It was about movement. Forward, always forward. Winston's early political career was a whirlwind. He spoke often, perhaps too often. His voice, high and slightly nasal in those days, rang with certainty. His arguments were laced with statistics, but also stories. He understood something many didn't. People remember how you make them feel, not just what you say. He championed social reforms, unemployment insurance, labour protections, and the minimum wage, radical ideas for a man from Blenheim. Yet he pressed forward with a kind of gleeful defiance. There was a moment in 1908, in the middle of a long debate about trade and tariffs, when Winston paused mid-speech. The room was loud. The speaker's gavel had just echoed through the chamber. He smiled faintly, adjusted his collar, and said, "If you cannot say what you mean, your silence will do the job for you." The chamber fell quiet. Not everyone liked him, but they listened. He was also made president of the Board of Trade, one of the youngest to hold that office. There, he pushed for reform with almost manic energy. Factories were inspected, miners received protections, children were kept from dangerous labour. Still, Churchill was no saint of the people. His views on empire remained sharp-edged. His belief in British superiority, inherited from his class, was never far from the surface. In speeches about India or Africa, his words often danced between paternalism and power. Even now, many find this paradox hard to swallow. One fringe anecdote tells of Churchill sneaking out from a late cabinet meeting in 1910 to attend a music hall show. Not because he was bored, but because the artist performing that night was rumoured to be mocking him in a new song. He reportedly sat in the back row, hat pulled low, grinning as the tune poked fun at his voice and policies. "Not a bad rhyme," he later said. "Terrible metre." If you had followed him out of Parliament that night, you might have seen him walking alone across Westminster Bridge, the Thames glinting below like an ancient ribbon of ink. The fog curled low, and the gas lamps shimmered just enough to catch his breath on the wind. That's something people forget, how often he walked alone. His pace was always hurried, his hat always tilted. He'd mutter to himself, trying out sentences for future speeches. Some passed him on the sidewalk and chuckled. Others quickened their pace, unsure what to make of him. But those words, whispered into fog, would one day roar across continents. He also faced deep criticism. His boldness in political reform brought enemies, and his stance on suffragettes, firmly against granting women the vote at the time, drew protests. Eggs were thrown, placards waved in front of his car. He was shouted down at rallies. Yet, strangely, Churchill thrived on the opposition. It sharpened him, made him cleverer. He wrote more, spoke more, appeared more. His name stayed in the headlines, not always flatteringly, but never absent. It was around this time that he met Clementine Hozier at a dinner party. Their meeting was brief, their courtship swift. In 1908, they were married. She, the calm to his storm. He, the storm to her patience. More on her soon, but even in these early days, her presence added a new dimension to him. Softer, more deliberate. One evening, years later, he would say to her, half asleep, "You make my rough edges disappear." The year was 1908. A spring morning broke over London, soft and slow, with the scent of hyacinths drifting through open windows and the sound of distant carriages echoing through narrow streets. It was on such a morning that Winston Churchill stood before an altar beside Clementine Hozier, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly in his. He had met her barely a year earlier at a dinner hosted by a friend. She was intelligent, reserved, and observant. A woman who could match Churchill's fire not by fanning it, but by grounding it. He, in turn, was awkward in affection, but utterly sincere. When he proposed to her in a garden at Blenheim Palace, under a grey sky and between two flower beds, she had paused just long enough to leave him squirming before saying yes. Their wedding day was private, modest by aristocratic standards. Winston wore a tailored morning coat and an expression of joyful disbelief. Clementine wore pale ivory silk and the quiet resolve of someone who already understood that life with this man would be an endless, roaring storm. He meant it. For all his boldness in public, he was always a little shy in love. Marriage softened some of his sharper edges. He began to write letters, dozens of them, overflowing with affection, mischief, and elaborate nicknames. Cat and Pug were their most frequent sign-offs. Clementine became his closest advisor. She knew when to push, when to praise, and when to close the door and leave him with his thoughts. They soon moved to a house in Eccleston Square. There, behind ivy-covered walls and wide windows, Churchill began to cultivate the routines that would define his domestic life. Rising late, working from bed, dictating letters while eating breakfast, and taking long baths, where ideas often arrived in waves of steam. Their first child, Diana, was born in 1909, and although Churchill was often buried in parliamentary briefs and committee meetings, he took pride in fatherhood. He was not a perfect parent, prone to mood swings, long absences, and dramatic declarations, but he doted on his children in ways his own parents never had. But peace would remain fleeting. Back in Parliament, Churchill had risen to Home Secretary, a powerful post with far-reaching responsibilities. It placed him in charge of prisons, policing, and the maintenance of civil order, and it brought controversy. One of the most debated episodes of his tenure was the 1911 siege at Sydney Street. An armed standoff with anarchists turned violent. Churchill, dressed in a top hat and long coat, arrived on scene personally. Photographers captured him watching the gunfire unfold with an almost theatrical stance. Critics mocked him. Was he there to lead or to be seen? They asked. Supporters claimed he was simply fearless. Historians still argue whether it was bravery or showmanship, or perhaps both. He later claimed he had no intention to command the police, only to observe. "I thought it would be interesting," he said dryly. But beneath the headlines and camera flashes, Churchill was deeply concerned with justice. He instituted reforms for prison conditions, advocated for the rehabilitation of young offenders, and took early steps toward penal reform that would later echo through history. He believed that even those who broke society's laws deserved a chance to reclaim dignity. One lesser-known story tells of his intervention on behalf of a young man sentenced harshly for theft. After reviewing the case personally, Churchill arranged for his sentence to be commuted. "If society cannot guide its children," he wrote in a private letter, "it must not be too eager to punish them." If you had been in his office that rainy Tuesday evening, you would have seen him there, coat draped over the chair, papers scattered like autumn leaves, a lamp casting yellow light over his tired eyes, as he scribbled a note in the margin of a legal file. Is there no path forward for this boy? Clementine, meanwhile, watched all this with a knowing eye. She attended functions on his behalf, hosted gatherings, soothed nerves after outbursts, and, above all, reminded Winston to breathe. "She is my filter," he once told a friend, "the only one who sees the chaos and doesn't run from it." They took walks in Hyde Park, strolled through Kensington Gardens with a pram, and once, during a particularly stressful season, ran away for a week to the coast just to watch the sea and read poetry aloud to each other. Churchill always returned to the centre of things, but these brief pauses with Clementine marked the pages of his life like pressed flowers. By the end of this chapter, Winston Churchill had become many things: reformer, husband, father, spectacle, and storm. But he was also, in the quiet hours between debates, just a man writing letters to his wife, humming to himself, painting in words what he could not yet see in the world around him. It was the winter of 1915, and the sea had turned cold with grief. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, stood at the edge of a decision that would haunt him for years to come. The Great War had engulfed Europe in trenches, wire, and whispering dread. The Western Front was locked in stalemate. Millions of lives hung in the balance, and Churchill, restless for movement, proposed an idea bold enough to break the silence. A naval attack through the Dardanelles, a way to outflank the Central Powers, strike at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, open a path to Russia, perhaps even end the war sooner. It was not madness. On paper, it shimmered with possibility. But maps lie, and paper cannot feel mud, or fire, or fear. The Gallipoli campaign began with promise, then with smoke, then with screams muffled by salt water. The landings failed, the cliffs spat fire, and so many young soldiers never came home. Thousands of them were Australian and New Zealander troops, whose names are still remembered each year on Anzac Day, whispered across beaches far from home. Historians still argue whether Churchill was fully to blame. The plan was approved by many hands, some more hesitant than others. But the world saw it as his idea, his ambition, his miscalculation. In London, the newspapers turned sharp. In the House of Commons, support slipped. The mood darkened. He was pushed out of the Admiralty, demoted, isolated, and just like that, the voice that had once boomed across chambers and continents now fell silent. If you had passed by his office during those days, you might have seen him sitting still for once, face half lit by a dying fire, reports crumpled on the desk, a glass untouched nearby. A man who had known the rush of praise now met the ache of disappointment, not from the enemy, but from his own people. He did not rage, he withdrew. He wrote to Clementine, "I am finished." But she knew better. In that stillness, another part of Winston emerged. The part not made of speeches or headlines, the part that simply endured. He turned to painting, bought oils and brushes and wandered into the garden with a canvas under one arm and a cigar clenched between his teeth. The first strokes were clumsy, the colours uncertain, but as the days passed, the movement of the brush steadied. Landscapes appeared, fields, ponds, places untouched by war. He also retreated into writing. He began work on the world crisis, a history of the war and his place in it. It would eventually span 6 volumes and contain not only political analysis, but something more intimate, his own struggle with ambition, error, and vision. Few politicians have ever documented their failures with such flourish. In a surprising twist, Churchill even returned to military service, not in an office, but on the front lines in France. As a major in the Royal Scots Fusiliers, he served quietly, wearing a standard uniform, commanding men whose names would not appear in books. He shared their meals, walked their trenches, endured the same mud and midnight shells. If you had stood with him during one of those long grey afternoons, the sky hanging low with gunmetal clouds, you might have noticed how he looked less like a statesman and more like a man trying to become something else entirely. He no longer barked orders, he listened. He wrote letters to Clementine filled not with rhetoric but with reflections. One of those letters reads, "Here, I am reminded that the earth itself does not care for our speeches, it only knows footsteps." That time in the trenches did something strange to him. It bent him closer to silence. It taught him patience, not his strength. And when he returned to England, he came not in triumph, but with something quieter in his pocket. Resilience. He slowly re-entered politics. First cautiously, then with his usual thunder. But the shine was different now. The edges softened. He had felt the bite of public scorn. He had tasted the pause between ambition and redemption. He would speak again, yes. But now there was a shadow stitched into his voice. One minor episode, barely mentioned in biographies, occurred in 1917. Churchill visited a military hospital near Birmingham. Among the wounded, he stopped by a soldier who had lost most of his speech from shell shock. Churchill didn't speak at first. He simply sat. After a few minutes, he took a piece of paper, drew a small sketch of a cat in a bowler hat, and passed it over. The soldier laughed, just once, and nodded. Some things, Churchill would later say, must be felt before they are said. If you had been watching from the hallway, you'd have seen a man, once bold, once fallen, choose kindness over charisma, if only for a moment. By the time the war ended in 1918, Churchill had regained some political standing. He became Minister of Munitions and later Secretary of State for War, but something deeper had shifted inside him. A seed of reflection had been planted. The war was over, but peace was an illusion. It was the early 1920s, and though the guns had fallen silent across Europe, the ground beneath Winston Churchill remained uncertain, muddy with memory, shifting with politics, and littered with the ghosts of both triumph and failure. He had returned from the trenches older, tempered, but not tamed. Once again, he found himself a key figure in government, now as Secretary of State for War and Air. And yet the world had changed. Empires were crumbling. Nations were restless. The British Empire was no longer a roaring lion. It was a weary creature holding tight to its edges. Churchill, ever the imperialist, stood firm on the matter. He believed the British Empire was a force for stability, order, and civilization, views that even then were increasingly questioned. In Ireland, rebellion simmered into bloodshed. In India, the call for self-rule grew louder. Historians still argue whether Churchill's views here came from genuine belief or unyielding pride. Was he defending a crumbling legacy or refusing to see the cracks? In 1921, Churchill travelled to Belfast. The Irish War of Independence had just ended, and a fragile truce was in place. He helped draft the Anglo-Irish Treaty, partitioning Ireland, a decision that pleased few and angered many. Violence broke out again soon after. He called it a settlement, but it felt more like a pause. If you had watched him exit the talks that day, walking briskly through a rain-drenched courtyard, you might have seen something flicker in his step. Not doubt, Churchill rarely allowed himself that luxury, but exhaustion. A man constantly asked to hold fire and water in the same hand. Yet amid the turmoil, there were quieter joys. Chartwell. That was the name of the house Churchill purchased in 1922, nestled in the rolling hills of Kent. Brick red and ivy-wrapped, it overlooked a pond that he would eventually build with his own hands. Chartwell became his refuge, his heartbeat. He painted there, read by the fire, planted roses with clementine, and wrote late into the night, surrounded by cigars and cats. You might be surprised to know that Churchill insisted on feeding his fish personally every morning, tossing crumbs and murmuring to them as if they were foreign ministers. "They are far less slippery," he once joked. Churchill returned to frontline politics with renewed force, taking on the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924 under a Conservative government. His most controversial move? Returning Britain to the gold standard in 1925, a decision that economists still debate. The theory was noble. Stabilise the currency, restore Britain's pre-war financial prestige. The reality? It strained the economy, raised unemployment, and deepened the hardship for miners and industrial workers. The coal miners' strike of 1926 exploded into the general strike, one of the largest industrial actions in British history. Churchill, ever combative, edited the government's emergency newspaper, the British Gazette, filling it with pro-government rhetoric and warnings about socialism. One article bore his unmistakable tone. Either the country will break the strike, or the strike will break the country. He took a hard stance, often seen as dismissive toward workers' struggles. Critics called him callous, supporters praised his strength. But the strike ended after 9 tense days, and Churchill's reputation among the working class would never fully recover. And yet, despite the headlines, there were moments of peculiar charm in these years. A fringe story from 1927 tells of Churchill attending a dinner at a gentleman's club, where a rival politician tried to bait him into a shouting match. Instead, Churchill rose calmly, lifted his wine glass, and toasted, "To our disagreements which keep us from boredom." The whole table roared. If you had been a waiter in the room, balancing a tray of puddings and port, you'd have seen something remarkable in that moment. Not the booming lion of later years, but a man who loved language more than fury, who disarmed with wit rather than war. By 1929, the political winds shifted. The Conservatives lost the election. Churchill once again was out of office. But this time something was different. He didn't fight it. Instead, he returned to Chartwell full-time. He wrote, he painted, he collected butterflies with his daughter Mary, and planted fruit trees with labourers who remembered the trenches too. His days took on a rhythm. breakfast in bed, dictation in the study, lunch with Clementine, then hours in his painting robe, palette in hand, painting golden fields under Kentish skies. To outsiders, it looked like retirement, but you would know better. This was not the end of the road. This was the curve before the storm. He was not resting. He was waiting. There is a quiet that comes before history changes direction, a breath held, a flame protected under glass. It was 1939. The world trembled once more beneath the weight of heavy boots and rising banners. Hitler's voice poured across radios like acid rain. Poland had fallen. France would soon follow. And yet, deep inside the government halls of Britain, hesitation hung thick in the air like smoke that refused to rise. But one man's voice, long ignored, had never softened. Winston Churchill had spent the better part of the 1930s in the political wilderness. No office, no power, just his pen, his convictions, and the slow ache of watching a world tip toward fire. He had warned them, again and again, about German rearmament, about the Nazi threat, about the danger of appeasement, but his warnings were dismissed as warmongering by many. He was, in their words, outdated, outspoken, out of step. Historians still argue whether Churchill's exile during these years was a blessing in disguise. Did it sharpen his vision, free him from political compromise, or did it leave Britain vulnerable for too long? He kept writing through it all. Speeches, letters, newspaper articles. His study at Chartwell became a fortress of ink, and inside, the flame of readiness never flickered out. Then, in September 1939, as German tanks rolled into Poland and the world woke in dread, the phone finally rang. Churchill was brought back, this time as First Lord of the Admiralty, the very position he had lost after Gallipoli. When the announcement was made, naval offices around Britain reportedly signalled, "Winston is back." The telegrams felt like a heartbeat restarting. You might imagine him that morning, standing in the Admiralty once again, fingers resting on a brass railing that still remembered his last touch. The room smelled of tobacco, wet wool, and something electric. He was older now, but not quieter. His voice returned to government like thunder through fog. And then came May 10th, 1940. The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had lost the confidence of the House. The Nazi army was sweeping across Western Europe. Britain needed a leader, and so King George VI sent for Winston. Churchill's own account of that moment is simple. "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." But destiny is not quiet. It does not come with clear skies and calm hearts. That very night, Germany invaded the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg. The storm had begun, and Churchill, suddenly Prime Minister, found himself not in celebration, but in crisis. If you had stood outside number 10 Downing Street that night, as the street lamps buzzed and blackout curtains were drawn tight, you might have glimpsed him through a window, not pacing, not speaking, but sitting perfectly still, hands steepled under his chin, listening to the silence between sirens. He knew what was coming, and yet he did not flinch. In the days that followed, Britain faced collapse in Europe. France was falling. British troops were stranded at Dunkirk. Bombs began to fall on English soil. And still, he stood. Churchill's first speeches as Prime Minister were not cheerful. They were not promises of peace. They were lightning wrapped in language. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." These words were not metaphors. They were maps. In the Commons, members leaned forward as he spoke, as if afraid to miss a single word. The British people, long afraid, long uncertain, felt something stir. Hope, not the soft kind. The kind that comes with clenched fists and square shoulders. One evening in July 1940, after a long day of bombings and meetings, Churchill visited a neighbourhood in the East End that had been hit hard. Children gathered around him, some barefoot. An elderly woman handed him a cup of tea, her hands shaking. He took it without a word, bowed his head slightly, and said, "You do me a kindness." That moment never made the papers, but those who saw it never forgot. If you had stood beside him in that bombed-out alleyway, the brick walls still warm with fire, the air thick with ash, you would not have seen a lion roaring. You would have seen a man, wrinkled, tired, and utterly steady, becoming something more than a politician, a symbol. The Blitz had begun. For nearly a year, London was bombed night after night. Fires lit the skies like false dawns, and yet the people did not break, because the voice on the radio, the one that growled and rose and sometimes paused so delicately, told them they would endure. In his wartime speeches, Churchill gave not just orders, but memory. "Let us so bear ourselves," he once said, "that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." And if you had been there, on a quiet street, in a small home, huddled around a radio glowing like a hearth, you would have believed him, because in that moment, it wasn't just a man speaking. It was a nation remembering what it meant to stand. The year was 1941, and the world had split wide open. Europe trembled beneath a tide of tyranny, and though Britain still stood, it stood alone. Every day brought new bombings, new names in telegrams, new fires flickering in the distance. The war had settled into something colder, heavier, a long, grinding night without a dawn in sight. And yet, inside 10 Downing Street, the light never fully went out. Winston Churchill, now firmly Prime Minister, worked relentlessly. Hours blurred. Sleep became a luxury. Meals came and went with barely a nod. He moved from cabinet meeting to war council to radio broadcast, his voice the single constant in a nation under siege. But he was not fighting alone anymore. In December of that year, everything changed. Pearl Harbor was attacked. The United States entered the war. And suddenly, Britain had an ally with industrial strength, oceans of resources, and a leader Churchill deeply admired, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Their alliance was more than politics, it was personal. Churchill once described meeting Roosevelt as like uncorking champagne, a mixture of excitement, energy, and just enough unpredictability to keep things lively. They exchanged hundreds of letters, often laced with humour, warmth, and occasional stubbornness. Churchill would write long, dramatic telegrams. Roosevelt, in turn, sent clever replies. They disagreed often, but always returned to mutual respect. A fringe story tells of Churchill, during his first visit to the White House, accidentally walking into Roosevelt's room after a bath, completely unclothed. Mortified staff watched in horror as Churchill, without flinching, declared, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Roosevelt laughed until his shoulders shook. Their friendship, built in crisis, became the spine of Allied cooperation. Together with Joseph Stalin, they formed a fragile triangle of strategy, patience, and distrust. But while Stalin remained a distant and cryptic figure, Roosevelt and Churchill's bond carried something warmer, a kind of wartime intimacy that helped hold the West together. If you had been seated in the corner of one of their strategy sessions in Washington, perhaps near a fireplace at the White House or beside a map-strewn table aboard HMS Prince of Wales, you'd have seen Churchill puffing a cigar, gesturing wildly, quoting Shakespeare between military briefings, and Roosevelt, eyes twinkling behind his pince-nez glasses, leaning forward, offering one of his slow, deliberate smiles. The two men, so different in style, found common ground in purpose. And yet, for all the diplomacy and dinners, Churchill remained very much in the thick of it at home. He visited bombed-out cities, met with grieving families, encouraged munitions workers, and often appeared without security, just his black coat, cane, and a bowed head. One day in Coventry, after a particularly brutal air raid, a woman placed her hand on his sleeve and said simply, "Thank you for not leaving us." He said nothing, just nodded once, and later wept in private. If you had walked alongside him that night, through streets still warm with ash, you might have noticed his silence. It wasn't emptiness, it was reverence for the people, for their endurance, for a spirit he admired more than he ever admitted. Back in London, his staff worked tirelessly, yet often found themselves at the mercy of his peculiar habits. He rarely kept a traditional schedule. He woke late, worked deep into the night, and often held war briefings while lounging in a silk robe, dictating with one hand and sipping whiskey with the other. His private secretaries learned to follow his rhythm, chaotic, demanding, but always somehow productive. They also learned not to interrupt his naps. One young assistant once barged in mid-afternoon to deliver a message. Churchill stirred, blinked, and said, "Unless it is the news of victory, let me sleep," then promptly rolled over. He was human, after all, and that humanity showed in moments that never made it into official records. A passing glance to a weeping mother, a handwritten letter to a soldier's widow, a habit of quoting poetry when the weight of reality pressed too heavily. He would lean back in his chair, eyes closed, and murmur, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow." He wasn't always gentle. His temper could flare. His judgments weren't always fair. He pushed his staff to exhaustion, clashed with generals, and held on to strategies long past their prime. But in the great tapestry of war, he was the thread that never broke. By 1943, as the tide began to turn, Churchill travelled to meet Stalin in Tehran alongside Roosevelt. The big three gathered in shadows and strategy, planning the shape of a future that did not yet exist. The war was not over, but there was light on the horizon. If you had stood at the edge of that conference room, beneath chandeliers that had seen centuries of diplomacy, you would have watched Churchill's pen tapping on the table as Stalin spoke. He didn't always like what he heard, but he listened, he calculated, he adapted. He was not always the hero the moment demanded, but he always showed up. As 1944 dawned, preparations for D-Day began. The invasion of Normandy would be the most daring operation of the war. Churchill wanted to be on one of the landing ships. His generals, horrified, begged him to stay behind. Roosevelt threatened to personally join if Churchill insisted. Reluctantly, Churchill stayed in London. But his spirit landed with those soldiers. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of France, Churchill stood in the war rooms, fingers clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on a wall of glowing maps. No speeches, no cheers. Just a whisper, "We are getting on with the job." That night, he didn't celebrate. He visited the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral alone. And as the organ played, he sat silently in the pews, head bowed. Because for all the fire and fury, Churchill understood something few leaders ever do. Victory does not arrive with noise, it arrives with reverence. It was May 1945. The war in Europe was over, crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, flags waved from every window, strangers embraced in the streets, church bells, long silenced during the Blitz, rang with a kind of joy that made your bones tremble. After 6 long years, the sound of peace had returned to Britain, not with quiet, but with celebration. And at the centre of it all, standing on a balcony above Whitehall, was Winston Churchill, top hat in hand, cigar between fingers, eyes scanning the jubilant crowd. He did not smile as broadly as others. His expression, if you had been there, was something more layered. Pride, yes, but also the weight of memory, of decisions made, of lives lost, of cities bombed and rebuilt in the same breath. The crowd below roared his name, chanting, "Winnie! Winnie!" He lifted his arm, offered the V for victory sign, and in that instant he was more than a man. He was a moment, a symbol, the voice that had carried them through fire, now standing at the edge of peace. But peace, for Churchill, came with a strange taste. Within just weeks of the German surrender, the political climate in Britain began to shift. People no longer wanted the voice of war. They wanted housing, employment, social reform. They wanted a quieter kind of leadership. Churchill, still wrapped in wartime language, was increasingly seen as a relic of the storm, not a shepherd for the calm. Historians still debate whether it was policy, fatigue, or simply timing. But in July 1945, the unthinkable happened. Winston Churchill lost the general election in a landslide. The man who had led Britain through its darkest hour was voted out of office. On the eve of its brightest dawn, Churchill was stunned. Not bitter, not angry, just stunned. "They have a perfect right to kick me out," he said to Clementine, "but it does hurt a bit." If you had seen him that day, stepping away from Downing Street, you might have been surprised by his dignity. He didn't protest, didn't resist, just packed his books, thanked the staff, and returned to Chartwell. The house greeted him like an old friend. He walked the rose garden, inspected the goldfish pond, and stood for a long while in his study, looking out across the hills. The Kent countryside had not changed. Perhaps that, more than anything, gave him comfort. He soon returned to painting, fields, trees, clouds suspended in brushstrokes. He hosted dinners, wrote essays, dictated notes for his war memoirs, which would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. His voice had left government, but not the world. Still, he couldn't resist watching politics from afar. A minor story from this time involves a quiet train ride to Oxfordshire. A group of schoolboys recognised him in the carriage. They nervously approached, asking if he'd come back someday. Churchill looked over his newspaper, smiled and said, "I'm like the tide, boys. I always return." And return he did. In 1951, at the age of 77, Churchill became Prime Minister once again. But the second time was not like the first. The war was over, Britain was rebuilding, and Churchill himself, older now, slower, moved with less fire. His speeches still carried force, but his body betrayed him. Minor strokes, frequent exhaustion, and the sharp awareness that his days of shaping destiny might be drawing to a close. Yet he pressed on. He focused on foreign policy, rebuilding the empire's alliances, and warning against the dangers of the Cold War. His Iron Curtain speech in 1946, delivered in the United States, became a chilling prophecy for decades of global tension. He called for unity, for strength, for wisdom beyond borders. You could almost see him standing at the podium that day, one hand resting on its edge, the other slicing through the air with words that carried not just fear, but hope. Hope that once again words might guide nations away from ruin. At home, his pace slowed. He spent more time at Chartwell, dictating in the mornings, napping in the afternoons, and painting until the shadows stretched long across the lawn. Clementine remained his anchor. Their bond, weathered by time and trial, deepened in those quiet years. She made sure he rested, scolded him when necessary, and filled the space between history's echoes with laughter. One evening, as they sat beneath the apple trees, sipping tea, she said, "You were born for war, my love, but I rather like you in peace." Churchill looked at her, winked and replied, "I'm still practicing." He eventually stepped down as Prime Minister in 1955, passing the torch with a dignity few politicians manage. He had seen too much, done too much to cling to power. But the world would not let him go quietly. Honours poured in, streets and ships were named after him, statues rose in parks and parliaments. And in 1953 he was awarded the Nobel Prize, not for war but for words, for the very thing he had used to shape the 20th century like clay. If you had been in the audience at that Nobel ceremony, you would have heard the citation read aloud. For his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. Not bad for the boy who once failed his Latin exam. As the decade drew to a close, Churchill became less present in public life, but his shadow remained enormous. Children would wave to him from train stations, veterans would tip their caps, strangers would press his hand, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they were shaking hands with someone who had once steadied the world. And if you had passed him on a quiet London street in 1959, walking slowly with a cane, hat pulled low, you might not have recognised him right away. But then he'd glance up, those eyes still sharp, still storm-coloured, and you'd feel it. The weight of 1,000 speeches, the echo of 1,000 days, the quiet power of someone who had given everything and then stepped back. He did not crave applause anymore, just the peace that only comes after the fight has been fought. It was 1960. The world was shifting, rapidly now. Empires were fading, televisions were humming in living rooms, and a new generation was coming of age. One that had not heard the Blitz sirens, one that remembered Churchill not as a wartime lion, but as a black and white figure in a history book. But he was still here. Winston Churchill, now in his mid-80s, had become something rare, a living monument. People no longer debated what he might do next. They simply wanted to thank him for what he already had. He spent most of his days at Chartwell. The gardens remained tidy, the pond full of fish that came to recognise his shadow. His easel still stood by the window, brushes waiting for colours that sometimes arrived, sometimes didn't. Visitors were frequent, politicians, journalists, family members. Some came with questions, others with gratitude. All left quieter than they had arrived. If you had been invited one afternoon to take tea with him, Just you, the fire crackling softly, the air filled with cigar smoke and distant bird call. You might have found him dozing in an armchair, an unread newspaper slipping from his hand. But the moment your teacup clicked on the saucer, his eyes would flicker open. "Ah," he'd say with a grin, "reality returns." He had long since stepped down from power. In 1955, he had formally resigned as Prime Minister for the final time. But even in retirement, he remained a force. He kept up correspondence with world leaders. Eisenhower wrote, so did de Gaulle. Even young John F. Kennedy made a pilgrimage to meet him, later calling it one of the great honors of his life. And yet, Churchill himself was less and less interested in global affairs. He had spoken enough. Now, he preferred to listen to the wind in the trees, to the rustle of newspapers, to the far-off laughter of his grandchildren running through the hedges. One of them once asked, "Grandpapa, were you afraid during the war?" Churchill smiled and replied, "Of course, but it's what you do with the fear that counts." Historians still debate what those final years meant to him. Did he feel sidelined, lonely, or was he, at last, content to watch the world spin without his hands on the wheel? His private secretary noted once that Churchill seemed happiest at twilight, those long evenings in Kent, when the sky turned orange and silver, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and old books. He'd sit outside with a whiskey, stare into the hills, and hum tunes no one could quite recognise, a charming, lesser-known detail. Churchill developed a fondness for the pink flamingo lawn ornaments that became briefly fashionable in the 1960s. One day, a friend brought him a pair as a joke. He placed them near the pond and insisted they stay. "They're delightfully absurd," he said, "and we need more of that." Even as his hearing dulled and his steps slowed, his mind retained sparks of the old flame. He would quote from Shakespeare suddenly, or recite lines from memory with perfect rhythm. Once, when asked how he felt about being a relic of the past, he replied, "I am not a relic, I am a reminder." One winter afternoon, he returned to Parliament as a guest of honour. The younger members stood in hushed awe as he was wheeled through the corridors, past portraits of men he had once argued with, laughed with, or outlasted. He said very little, but when someone nervously asked, "Do you miss it?" he chuckled, "Number. But I do miss the fight." Outside, the snow had begun to fall. The city, so often rebuilt, now gleamed with fresh light. Churchill looked out at it through a frosted window and whispered, "London will always be my city." And it was. Even as new faces entered politics, new voices filled radios, and new troubles arose across continents, his legacy remained woven into the very bricks and bones of Britain. By 1963, the United States Congress awarded him honorary citizenship, an extremely rare honor. President Kennedy delivered a tribute, calling him a resolute defender of freedom. Churchill, too unwell to attend, had his son Randolph read a message of thanks on his behalf. "If I had my time again," the message said, "I should have liked to spend it alongside you." There was a quiet poetry in those words, less grand, more human. If you had walked through Chartwell on one of those last summer mornings, sunlight warming the stones, you'd hear the scratch of a pen, the faint buzz of a radio, the clink of breakfast china. Life continued, but slower, more carefully. He was not waiting for anything now, just walking the final paths with grace. One last anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true. A journalist once asked him what he considered his greatest accomplishment. Churchill paused, looked toward the window and said, "That I never gave up, even when I wanted to." And that, in the end, may have been his truest legacy, not victory, not eloquence, but endurance. It was January 1965. The frost hung low across the lawns of Hyde Park. In London, the chimneys smoked a little heavier, and the sky felt close, like it had paused, just for a moment, to listen. Winston Churchill had lived through 90 winters, but this one was different. Though the world around him continued, cars on cobblestone, papers rustling in cafes, radios playing soft music behind curtains, those closest to him knew the days were drawing in. At his home in Kensington, time had slowed. He no longer walked far. His meals were quiet. His sentences, once booming and elaborate, had shortened to nods and glances. The Churchill of Parliament, of wartime radio, of roaring oratory, had faded into a man of fewer words and more memory. And yet, even in these final weeks, something enduring glowed behind his eyes. When visitors came, diplomats, admirers, old friends, he would still raise his glass in greeting. Sometimes he would quote a line from Shakespeare. Sometimes he would simply whisper, "Carry on." If you had sat in that drawing room by the window, the curtains drawn back just a little, you would have seen him there, wrapped in a heavy blanket, gazing out at a world he had helped shape. Not a man clinging to legacy, but a man quietly observing the view he had long imagined. He passed away peacefully on the 24th of January, exactly 70 years after the death of his father. Church bells tolled across the city. Flags dropped to half-mast. The world fell silent, as if recognizing that an age had ended. Messages arrived from presidents, kings, poets, and ordinary people alike. Not all agreed on his legacy, but none ignored it. Historians still argue whether Churchill was the last great imperialist or the first modern statesman, whether his fire was born of brilliance, ego, or necessity. But all agree, he changed the course of history, not with machines, but with conviction, not with charm, but with will. His state funeral, the first granted to a non-royal since the Duke of Wellington, was watched by over 300 million people worldwide. They lined the streets as his coffin passed by, draped in the Union Jack. The River Thames itself seemed to slow, its waters reflecting the sombre sky. One story, quietly powerful, comes from that very procession. As his coffin floated down the river, a group of dock workers, rough-handed men who remembered the Blitz, stood on the rooftops. As the barge passed, they lowered the cranes in unison, a final salute from the working class he had once both championed and challenged. If you had been among them that day, you might have looked up and seen one of them remove his cap, not out of habit, but out of something deeper, something that could not be put into headlines. Respect, gratitude, memory. At Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace, where he was born, Churchill was laid to rest in a small, modest grave beside his parents and his beloved Clementine, who would join him years later. No grand marble structure, just a stone, just a name. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, 1874 to 1965. And that was all. But his story, of course, did not end there. Around the world, his speeches still echo in classrooms, his silhouette still stands in statues, his words etched in the marrow of nations that once stood on the brink. People still quote him, sometimes for courage, sometimes for wit, sometimes for the reminder that words still matter. He is remembered not as a flawless man, he was deeply human and deeply flawed, but as one who met his moment with unshakable force. In times of peace, his stubbornness frustrated. In times of war, it saved. And that, perhaps, is the paradox of Churchill. Not the perfect leader, but the right one for the hour he was needed. If you walk through Parliament today, his statue stands with hat and cane in hand, gaze fixed forward as if still listening to the wind for what comes next. Tourists pass by, some smiling, some silent. A child once left a note by his feet. It read, "Thank you for being brave when everyone else was scared." And perhaps that says more than any history book ever could. He was not just the man who led Britain through the war. He was the man who reminded the world what a voice can do. By the late 1960s and beyond, Churchill's presence was no longer a living one, but a lingering echo. And what an echo it was. You could hear it in the quiet confidence of a generation that had once crouched beneath sirens and now walked freely under open skies. You could find it in the stained pages of schoolbooks, in the breathless silence of documentaries, in the rising cadences of political speeches that drew from his rhythm, often without even realizing it. He had become part of the architecture of memory. And yet, the legacy of Winston Churchill was never simple. Some remembered him as the Lion of 1940, the man whose voice rose louder than the bombs, who rallied Britain with a vocabulary forged in fire. Others remembered him as the last gasp of empire, a man who held fast to colonial values even as the world turned toward liberation. Historians still argue whether his greatest strength was his foresight or his unshakable conviction, whether he changed history or simply bent it around his will. In India, memories of Churchill stir far less admiration. His response to the 1943 Bengal famine, marked by delay, indifference, and deeply troubling remarks, remains one of the darkest stains upon his legacy. Millions suffered, and while the causes of the famine were many, Churchill's role remains a point of sharp debate. Elsewhere in the empire, his resistance to self-rule movements was equally fierce. He viewed decolonization as dangerous, often invoking the order of British rule in a world he saw slipping into chaos. His critics saw arrogance, his supporters saw caution. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. If you were walking today through a university hallway, past a class studying modern history, you might hear a professor pause mid-lecture and ask the students, how do we remember someone who did both great and grievous things? And that is the eternal question of Churchill, not just what he did, but how we choose to carry it. Despite the complexity, one thing is undeniable. He shaped the 20th century not with technology or armies, but with imagination, resolve, and the sheer force of his voice. He left behind millions of words, speeches, letters, books, paintings, memos, notes scribbled in the margins of newspapers. Entire libraries now bear his name, not just in Britain but across the world, and within them, a mind that never truly rested, a beautiful lesser-known detail from his later years. Churchill kept a globe in his study, not for planning, but for reflecting. He would sometimes turn it slowly while dictating letters, not with the purpose of charting conquest, but of reminding himself just how vast the world truly was. So small a creature, he once murmured, with so much ambition. You might visit Chartwell today and see his studio still set up. Brushes by the window, half-finished paintings of water and stone. The pond, now tended by caretakers, still glimmers with the same quiet ripples. You can stand on the patio and look out toward the hills he loved, and in that stillness, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear him. The murmur of a pen, the clink of a whiskey glass, the echo of a man thinking beyond his time. His family, too, carries the memory. His grandchildren speak of him with warmth and awe, of a man who could recite verse one moment and grumble about soup the next, who believed utterly in himself, but also needed his cat by his side to sleep soundly. He was not always easy, but he was never ordinary. In public, Churchill became the blueprint for wartime leadership. In private, he remained full of contradiction, tender and stormy, generous and sharp, poetic and pragmatic. He once said to Clementine, "I am a puzzle, even to myself." And perhaps that's why we continue to look closely, because within that puzzle is something universal, the desire to matter, the ache to endure, the hope that even when the world is falling apart, a single voice can still hold it together for just a little longer. And so, the legacy of Churchill doesn't rest solely in museums or monuments. It lives on in how we speak when we are afraid, in how we choose to lead when there is no clear path, in how we remember that conviction, at the right moment, can become a compass. He is gone, but his story lingers, not as a shadow, but as a light flickering across the past, reminding us that courage, though imperfect, can still echo. In London, if you walk past Parliament Square just after sunset, when the crowds thin and the red buses slow to a hum, you might find yourself standing before a bronze statue. There he is, Winston Churchill. One hand rests on a cane, the other tucked in his coat. His gaze is fixed forward, past the iron gates of Westminster, past the black cab traffic, past even time itself. The pigeons sometimes perch on his hat. The tourists sometimes giggle or nod or say his name aloud, just to hear it echo in the space between centuries. And yet he does not move. He simply watches. It is one of many statues, one in Parliament Square, another in Washington, D.C., and countless across Britain and beyond. Streets bear his name. So do schools, lecture halls, ships, hotels, awards, parks, and even a bulldog or two. His image is familiar. His voice, digitized, can still stir rooms into silence. But the question lingers in quiet corners. How do we remember him now? In the decades since his passing, Churchill's legacy has remained in constant conversation. not just among scholars, but in parliaments, classrooms, novels, films, and casual debate. He is both lionized and scrutinized, both memorialized and questioned. Historians still argue whether we've gotten any closer to knowing the man behind the myth. Because Churchill, perhaps more than any leader of the modern age, was both performer and architect of his own legacy. He knew how to frame history even as it unfolded around him. In his writings, particularly the Second World War memoirs, he cast himself as both narrator and protagonist. It's been said that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it, and he did. But beyond the lines he crafted, the world has continued to explore the lines he crossed. In recent years, protests have emerged around his statues, some calling for their removal, others fiercely defending them, not because people have forgotten him, but because remembering him fully requires facing contradictions that are uncomfortable. Churchill stood against fascism. He also supported colonialism. He defended democracy, and yet held views about race, empire, and power that feel alien, sometimes painful, in today's world. To some, he is a symbol of strength. To others, a symbol of something lost and no longer fitting. And yet, he remains, not because he is universally beloved, but because he is unignorable. There's a story, perhaps true, perhaps more poetic than real, of a young boy visiting the cabinet war rooms beneath London. He stares at Churchill's chair, still preserved behind the glass, the red leather cracked slightly with age, and he asks, "Was he perfect?" His father replies, "No, but he was there when it counted." Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not perfection, but presence. Churchill was not the most moral man of his time, nor the most visionary, but he was often the most necessary. When the sky fell, he stood. When the winds howled, he roared back. And in doing so, he helped shape the tone of resistance for millions. His legacy is not just about what he did, it's about what he meant. In moments of great fear, people return to his words. Never, never, never give in. In moments of indecision, to each there comes a moment. And in moments of self-doubt, success is not final, failure is not fatal. These quotes hang not just in halls of power, but on bedroom walls, office cubicles, and coffee mugs. They're recited before speeches, before interviews, before life's more personal battles. If you ever find yourself alone in the Churchill war rooms, those dimly lit tunnels beneath the city, you might feel something different. The air still smells faintly of damp paper and steel. The maps remain, the pencils rest in place. The silence carries a strange energy. Not just history preserved, but history remembered. And in that quiet, you realize, legacy is not carved in stone. It is felt in the gut, in the breath before a decision, in the line we quote before we try again. Churchill's greatest legacy may not be the battles he won or the policies he penned, but the idea that language, conviction, and resolve can sometimes hold back the dark just long enough for the light to return. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. And perhaps, when the winds rise again, when the world needs a voice, we'll remember that once there was a man who stood alone and still stood. And so we return, one final time, to the image with which we began. A small room at 10 Downing Street, a desk, a lamp glowing faintly. A man seated, not tall, but broad and still, the smoke from his cigar curling like a question above him. Outside, the streets are dark, the windows are shuttered, and the world holds its breath. You are standing quietly in the corner, just a shadow, just a watcher, as Winston Churchill leans forward and begins to speak. Not with bluster, not with poetry, just with purpose. We shall go on to the end. And in that moment, all the roads of his life seem to narrow and meet, like tributaries rushing into one inevitable river. The lonely boy at Blenheim Palace, the young soldier chasing glory in distant deserts, the journalist scribbling by candlelight in a prisoner's cell, the parliamentarian crossing floors and defying the tides, the reformer who stirred unrest and shook the system, the prime minister whose words steadied a trembling nation. All of them were him, and now, here he was. His voice carrying not just across radio waves, but across generations. If you look closely, you see that he was never just a man. He was a mirror of his time. Flawed, brilliant, brave, unyielding, wrong, right. All of it at once. A mosaic of ambition and accident, insight and instinct. The rest of his story is known: the speeches, the awards, the state funeral watched by millions, the legacy, complicated and colossal. But here, now, at the edge of his journey, we don't need monuments. We need a breath. We need to remember that every legend, every line of history, is still a life, and his was a full one, loud and long and lit with fire. Churchill once said, "To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and asked to do something unique to their talents." He was asked, and he answered. And when the storm broke loose, when bombs rained down and fear wrapped itself around every home like smoke, he stood in the center of it all and said, "This will not break us." Not because he knew the future, but because he refused to surrender to it. Today, in the quiet of evening, you can still hear him, if you listen, in the creak of a wooden bench near the Thames, in the pages of a speech tucked behind glass in a museum, in the flicker of film showing a V sign from a window, in every moment where someone feels the fear and speaks anyway. Because that, in the end, is the story of Winston Churchill. Not that he was never afraid, but that he never let fear silence him. He taught us that words can be weapons, that ideas can be shields, that presence, true presence, can be enough to hold the line. And perhaps that is all we ever need when the night grows long and the winds rise. Not perfection, not certainty, just the echo of a voice that reminds us, never give in. Now let the journey fade gently into memory. Close your eyes, if they haven't already drifted closed. Breathe softly. Somewhere far away, the chiming of Big Ben echoes through empty streets. The Thames moves quietly beneath her bridges, carrying the weight of centuries without complaint. The city sleeps, and so do the memories. In the stillness of your room, imagine walking once more through Chartwell's gardens, dew underfoot, roses blooming in the morning light. The hills roll out before you like the folds of a well-worn map, and at the edge, just beyond the hedgerow, a man paints the sky with broad, bold strokes. He does not look back. He is too busy imagining. Let your thoughts settle like snow. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the past. Because history, after all, is not just a list of events. It's the hush between them. It's the sigh of a world remembering where it's been. And tonight, you've walked those paths. You've stood beside the boy, the soldier, the leader, the man. You've heard the words that stirred nations. You've watched as a single life bent the arc of time, and now there is only silence, the good kind, the kind that lingers after something meaningful. Let it wrap around you like a warm coat. Let it rock you gently, like the sea Churchill once sailed across in wartime, now calm at last. You've been present for a life, and the rest is history.